surprised when I came in at the end of Steve Woolgar's lecture to see a room full of people and Steve giving a lecture with PowerPoint presentations. That wasn't what I imagined was going to happen today. I thought I was going to come in and there'd be, 6 or 10 students and we'd sit around the table and have a nice chat. So I haven't got any formal presentation to give. I prepared some remarks that I thought would lead into discussions, and maybe they still can lead into discussions, but my remarks, as Oleg said, rather take it for granted that people have read the texts that I sent in advance. So all I can do is run through these remarks. I can elaborate them in any way you like, and see where it goes. The readings that I sent along were chapters 1 and 2 of my book, The Mangle of Practice, the 2 short postscripts from the end of that book, and a chapter from the book that I edited called The Mangle in Practice. My chapter was called New Ontologies. I thought this was not a bad selection of readings because it talks about, as it were, the trajectory of my research. Chapter 1 starts by talking about where I was coming from. Chapter 2 is the first real case study in the book, The Mangle of Practice. And that book has been the basis for all of my work since I wrote it in the early 1990s. So that kind of provides the basis for everything that I've done after that. And the New Ontologies paper was very important to me in kind of widening the frame of my work beyond the classic subject matter of science and technology studies. I'm afraid I've drifted rather a long way away from the heartland of STS over the years, for better or for worse. Okay, so I can make some remarks on these chapters. The first chapter of my book obviously tries to set the scene for what's going to follow. And maybe the thing to think about here is that I talk about the historical background of how science and technology studies have developed up until the mid-1990s as a way of trying to set the scene for what I wanted to do in the rest of the book. And I can talk about that a bit. The historical background was, on the one hand, the classic sociology of knowledge approach, the sociology of scientific knowledge, the social construction of technology as it had developed up until the 1990s. And the other side of the background to my book was actor network theory, and I talk about both of those in the introduction. Biographically, I got into STS in 1976, a very long time ago now, when I moved to the Science Studies unit in Edinburgh. Before that, I had gone down to Bath, which was closer to where I was living at the time in London, and who should I meet but Trev and Harry, Trevor Pinch and Harry Collin. It was a very small world in those days. I didn't go to, I think the reason I went to Edinburgh and not to Bath was that Edinburgh had a much better library. I'd been a physicist, I was obviously going to do kind of science studies of physics, and they had all the journals in Edinburgh. But I don't think they had them in Bath. They didn't have Phys Rev.
Simple as that?
Yeah, right. The climate was much better in Bath. So I went to Edinburgh, the Science Studies unit, where a few other important people were in those days: David Bloor, Barry Barnes, Steve Shapin, the founders of the so-called STRONG program in the sociology of scientific knowledge. The aim of the sociology of scientific knowledge in those days was to give distinctively sociological explanations of scientific beliefs. According to David Bloor, who wrote the famous 4 tenets of the Strong Program, the name of the game was to give social explanations of scientific beliefs. This was a very radical and controversial idea and program in those days. It was very exciting. It was exciting because to try and explain scientific knowledge sociologically was to upset all sorts of taken for granted ideas about truth, reality, rationality, you name it. The natural attitude, of course, is to think that science just gives a true description of how the world really is. And the claim was, no, that's not the case at all. It's the social that matters. It's the social that somehow tells us that the world is built out of quarks. DNA is the unit of inheritance. We think that's true, but no. The object of the sociology of scientific knowledge was to say, we believe that because of something to do with our social situation, social structure, social interests, something like that. So I joined in this game, and I followed the standard methodological pattern, which was to look at scientific controversies. The great thing about looking at a controversy is that you aren't tempted to say, nature decides what scientists believe. If you have 2 different groups of scientists believing different things, it can't be nature that's telling them to believe one thing or another, therefore it must be something else, and therefore that something else would be the social. I think that was the approved line of argument, right? So I looked at a few very recent controversies in the history of particle physics, and I decided that there was something missing from the sociology of scientific knowledge picture that was being elaborated in those days. What I would say now is that I discovered that the social is not actually an independent cause of scientific beliefs. The social doesn't come first and determine the contents of scientific knowledge. And the best way to see that is to note that the social is not something stable, reliable, from which other things flow. The social, in all of its many dimensions, is continually transformed and becomes something new in and through scientific and technological practice. So the social isn't something given that you can reach for and use to explain something else. The social is itself continually changing. And the view that I ended up with is that social structures, social interests, disciplines, whatever, co-evolve with fields of machines and instruments and bodies of knowledge. All of these things become something new all of the time in relation to one another. There's no still center that explains the changes in anything else. The social, the material, the conceptual, all change open-endedly and unpredictably in relation to one another. And sometimes the bits fit together and interactively stabilize one another. And that's when you've got a reliable bit of knowledge for a certain time, or you've got a machine that works. And I think this move away from classical sociology and SSK was important because, as a matter of fact, society does change all the time. And in fact, it seems to change more and more rapidly all the time. And we need to be able to get a handle on that and understand how our social world is changing. And obviously, science and technology have got an awful lot to do with social change. So to understand the world we live in, we need to be able to think about how our society, our knowledge, our fields of machine are all evolving together. We need some resources for thinking about things like that. And SSK and even classical sociology just don't provide any resources. Realizing this in the late 1980s helped me to understand much better the work of the actor network theorists, Bruno Latour, Michel Calon, Jean Law. As I explain in the chapter that some of you have read, if I had one difference between, I think, me and the actor network is that I'm still much keener on thinking about the material components of our culture, objects, instruments, machines, than I think the actor network people are. The great struggle for me in my early years in science studies was trying to figure out how to write about the materiality of scientific culture. So much of the writing in science studies was about ideas and about knowledge, and it was a puzzle. How do you get material stuff into the writing? How can you thematize the importance of machines, instruments, and so on? So that was the kind of theoretical background that I talk about in chapter 1 of the Mangle. There was one other point I thought I could emphasize here today, which concerns what I talk about in the book as a switch from what I call the representational idiom for thinking about science and technology to the performative idiom. I'm still trying to get to grips with this myself. It seems very important to try and get performance, action, agency into our thinking about the world in general. But it's very hard to focus your attention on it. It's so easy to drift back into talking about ideas and theories rather than performance. So what's the difference between these two idioms? The representational idiom is the usual one for talking about science. It goes with SSK, it goes with classical sociology, and it goes with, I think, our common sense, the funny kind of educated common sense about what science is. The representational idiom enshrines, takes for granted the idea that science is above all a body of articulated knowledge, theories, experimental reports, whatever. When you think about science, you think about the knowledge that scientists have. You focus on that knowledge, and the job of SSK was to explain knowledge, right? It's very securely in what I call the representational idiom. But what if you want a kind of living example of the representational idiom, Steve Walgar would be a very nice one, right? I mean, I just caught the end of his lecture, but he was talking about how people talk. He was talking about what representations are like, how you can make different kinds of representations of anything. My work in science studies increasingly focused on trying to understand scientific practice, what scientists do in the laboratory. And just trying to do the best I could accounting for scientific practice, I concluded that it was no use to remain within the representational idiom, just to talk about the kinds of accounts that scientists give of the world. is not enough to get a grip on what scientific practice is actually like. And instead I decided that one had to switch to a kind of performative idiom. We had to find a way of writing which was about performance. It was about doing things rather than just knowledge. This is the performative idiom. The idea is to think about science and, I later concluded everything else, just being in the world in general. We should start by thinking in terms of agency, performance, action, doing things. Scientists actually do things in the laboratory. And if you look at what happens in the laboratory, the world does things. All those machines and instruments are continually performing and doing things. And these performances of the human and the non-human, the scientists and the apparatus and the machines, are reciprocally coupled to one another. This is what I decided in what I eventually called a dance of agency, in a process that I called mangling, which I also described as a dialectic of resistance and accommodation. All of these phrases are trying to get at the coupled performances of people and things. So what, right? I think this is, and I'm still struck by this, and I'm still a bit puzzled by it myself. It's an unfamiliar, and for some reason, it's a difficult way of looking at science, engineering, or our everyday being in the world. And it's one that symmetrizes the picture. I caught Steve talking about symmetry, but I'm not sure what he said because I was walking around outside sightseeing. But I want to say that these ideas about mangling and the dance of agency symmetrize the picture of the relations between the human and the non-human. So traditional sociology, from Durkheim onwards up to the sociology of scientific knowledge, is in these terms asymmetric. Traditional sociology takes it for granted that people are the only real agents in the world. We call the shots. We have the initiative in our dealing with nature. On the other hand, nature is not an agent, it's something passive. It sits there and it waits for us to either do things to it or to know it. We stand there and we look at passive nature and we construct knowledge. That's the traditional sociology of knowledge account. If you switch from the representational idiom to the performative idiom, things look very different. At the level of performance, people and things, the human and the non-human, are much the same. This is what I mean by symmetry. We do things as human beings, but so do cats and dogs, rocks and stones, cars, computers, drugs. They all do things in the world too. And this is the symmetry of the human and the non-human that fascinates me. And I was very inspired in trying to think about this by the writings of the Actor Network people, especially Bruno Latour. And it's this symmetry at the level of performance that seems to upset so much the classical sociologists and philosophers. All right, that's what I wanted to say about chapter 1. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions about that?
I have a question about environmental practice. First, thank you for the idea of intentionality.
The idea of what?
Intentionality.
Intentionality.
All right.
And what is, the question is, how can you define what knowledge is? You don't give a definition in your book, but very interesting what I think. How can you explain what is it?
What is knowledge?
Well, let me put, I think when Andy is thinking what the intentionality thesis is, In chapter 1 of his book, and that's what Georgi likes so much, what Andy says about Latour's theory is that in Latour, allegedly, humans and humans have the same capacity to act, which is not true, of course, as we know, because only human agents have intentionality. We can try ascribing intentionality to non-human agents, like intentionality of a cat flap, which Andy mentions in a footnote. But there's a radical asymmetry which Latour hides. That was the argument. And Georgi, coming from not the sociological background, but rather from the technical university background, of course, liked the statement of the asymmetry. But right now the question is on knowledge, after I gave you some time to think.
Oh, right. Well, maybe these things are all bound together. I mean, I think of the world as a kind of place of multiplicity. There are all sorts of different kinds of entities in the world that are all kind of co-evolving with one another. And we can point to the kind of the specificity of different elements of this multiplicity. So, obviously one specific thing about human beings is that we do talk, we do construct representations. I don't think rocks and stones do that kind of thing. On the other hand, rocks and stones have got their own specific property. For me, knowledge and representations are a kind of way of being in the dance of agency. They're part of our way of handling this kind of performative back and forth between ourselves and the world. We construct representations as kind of summaries of what's happened in the past that we try to project into the future. This projecting into the future thing goes with the ideas about intentionality that I kind of sketched out in chapter 1. We construct imaginary futures and then we try and act them out or get to some point that we've imagined on the basis of what's happened in the past. We can say all that, it's true, and I don't think my cat back home acts like that. And that's a large part of the analysis of science, of course. The mistake would be to think that our intentions, our goals, our plans, whatever you want to call them, are the explanatory center of what happens in the laboratory or anywhere else. The point that I try to emphasize in the mangle is that our future plans and goals grow out of what the present state of culture is, including machines, material agency and things like that. And that the goals themselves are mangled. They're bound up in the flow of practice. They don't run the show. As I showed in chapter 2 of the mangle, Donald Glaser starts off with certain goals for his practice. But in dealing with the agency of machines and trying to see what he can get them to do, he was continually changing his plans as well. So plans, representations, knowledge, all of these things are part of the dialectic of resistance and accommodation. They all become something new and they grow together. I didn't really define what knowledge was, but it's words, maps, representations, language, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Short question. I think I have a short question. How can you, in this chapter, you were providing some very productive critiques of alternative theory. From the point of view that semiotical perspective sometimes is not productive. But I don't really understand how can you avoid this from your point of view, because can we work with material objects directly? I'm not really sure. And when you were answering the questions of our students, you said that we need to work with representations, plans, but it's humans again. But how can we work with material objects directly? Without semiotics, without Latourian and Chicken demand? That's my question.
I mean, the modern academic disciplines start by thinking about our relation to the world in terms of knowledge and language. Over the last few hundred years since Descartes, academics have learnt to write as if something distinctly human, like knowledge, has to be our central concern. Right? And then there are various analyses of what knowledge, language, and representation are like. And I think the most interesting account of that surely comes from the actor network. You know, Latour, I think, is still obsessed with questions of representation. He's very happy when he's telling you things about representation, and he tells you incredibly interesting things about representation, how words, statements, knowledge are tangled up in networks of stuff. There's no way to force people out of that way of thinking. You know, we've mastered the art over the last 100 years. We could carry on forever along that line in that representational idiom. There's no way to use words to force people out of it. All I can think of doing is to try to invite you to start from somewhere else. How could we begin from somewhere else? This is the question. So I think what I do in my work is try to evoke something which is actually really obvious, that, you know, all the time we're doing things in the world, and the world's doing things to us. I mean, I actually just started to wonder if I was going to die when I was walking around St. Petersburg. I was getting so cold, you know. I was worried about my toes. I was thinking I got this woolly hat in my bag, but I hadn't put it on. You know, we're totally engaged in this world of performance, right? And we can all remind ourselves of that quite easily. This is a different place to start from the representation. All I need is this sense of a lively engagement with a lively world. And then you just kind of build up another picture. You say, well, how does knowledge fit into this story? So it's a question of, you know, trying to encourage people to start from somewhere else rather than from language. Okay.
Okay, Katerina. I see there are many questions.
I want to continue asking about some personal details. Our notion of mangle and mangle, how does it come to you to call it mangle? It's very interesting.
Was it just a question about the word mangle?
Exactly, about mangle and mangle. How does it come to you to use this?
Mangle для перевода. Вальцы практики по-русски перевели зачем-то. Вальцы. Ну это для белья, когда вот каток прокатываешь.
How did it come to me? When I started trying to analyze scientific practice, I first of all began to talk about what I called resistance and accommodation. So if you think about, you know, scientists working in the laboratory, typically they have got some goal they're aiming at, and typically things go wrong, right? I mean, I remember this from when I was a kind of undergraduate and I had to do work in the physics lab. You know, something going wrong, a kind of block that arises between you and where you want to get to, I called a resistance, right? And it's just that. You've run into something that doesn't work and you don't know what it is or why. Okay. And then the other term was accommodation. When you run into a resistance, in some way, scientists try and get round it. There's no prescription for how to get round it. You can try fiddling with the apparatus, or you could try changing the equations, or moving to a different laboratory or something. And that's what I meant by accommodation. And it seemed to me that the best analysis I could give of practice was a continual back and forth between resistance, accommodation, in a kind of an emergent fashion. You can't say resistance and accommodation too often, right? That's how many syllables. It takes a long time to say resistance and accommodation. It's not a great phrase. You can't use it as an adjective, you can't use it as a verb, it doesn't have a past tense. So at some point I thought I need a word for this. And the word that came into my mind was mangle. And I've been stuck with it ever since. It's not a great word. It doesn't translate into any other language. Most people in English don't know what it means either. I think probably another reason for using it, which might be a bit more interesting, is that resistance and accommodation is human-centered, right? So this is a description of what practice looks like to a human scientist. I've run into a resistance, I'm making some accommodation. It's all about people. When I was writing the mangle, it finally dawned on me, and people, I think, must have said it to me too. You know, the material world doesn't just resist us, it does things. And a lot of human practice is trying to kind of, as I said, enroll, seduce, capture material agency, somehow line it up with our projects. This is another way of talking about the symmetry of the human and the non-human. And you know, in a way, mangle seems like a more symmetric word to use than dialectic of resistance and accommodation. Also, you know, mangling is a word with a bit of an edge to it. You know, it's a bit of a silly word. it disrupts formal philosophical discourse. It mangles it in a way. It's also a word for a bit of equipment in the kitchen. That's what I was thinking of, squeezing the water out of the washing. So it's even a bit of a kind of feminine metaphor which disrupts the masculinist discourse of philosophy of science. Yeah, it's quite a nice disruptive word in that sense. Such a great word. I mean, I think I prefer mangles to rolling pins in the sense that mangle has got a bit more of a sense of open-ended transformation to it. A rolling pin just flattens the dough, whereas I really want a word for kind of something that makes an unpredictable transformation in the world. But I couldn't think of a machine that does that.
There was a question anyway, which wasn't finished.
Понятно. Вопрос следующий. Вот если принять сугубо, для меня сугубо гипотетические предположения о симметрии вещей и людей, то из этого никак не следует, что антропная идентичность, человечность человека должна быть оставлена в стороне. Понятен вопрос? То есть, должны ли мы отказаться тем самым, исходя из симметричности, в императиве, так сказать, защиты человечности человека?
I'm not denying the specificity of the human. I'm merely pointing out that we humans are caught up in a historical process that we don't control. at the level of performance, we're on the same level as things. I'm also very interested in, back in England, philosophers like to ask the question, what does it mean to be human? And they want to give some kind of essentialist answer. You know, the really important thing about being human is X. It interests me a lot to think about what Michel Foucault calls technologies of the self. I'm interested to think about how our interior being is bound up with the environment, with all sorts of technologies, how they modify us, how new kinds of selves come into existence. The transhumanists, it seems to me, are very dualist, they're Cartesian. They think they know what the human essence is and they want to perfect it. Whereas if you think in a kind of manglish fashion, the interesting question is, the interesting possibility is to explore what we might become without knowing where we're going, right? Instead of trying to perfect the human race, it would be very interesting to experiment and see what different kinds of people we could be.
Кстати, очень любопытно, что эту книгу Фуко, которую вы упоминали, на русский язык была переведена как «Практики себя», а не технологии. Поэтому ваш вариант, естественно, всю технологию в буквальном смысле слова, да, соотносит с человеком.
That's interesting that the book that you mentioned about Foucault, I mean, it's translated in Russian as practice of your own self.
Yeah.
Rather than technologies.
Yeah, rather than technologies.
All right.
Я думаю, здесь просто I'll answer in Russian, just like to English. Дело в том, что просто, скажем, в этом типе рассуждения не утверждается, что есть первоначальная природа человека, про которую мы знаем, что она X. Есть набор действий, которые может выполнять как машина, так и человек, в зависимости от того, где мы проводим границу. И появление интернета, например, в их теоретизировании интересно не тем, что оно, соответственно, как-то подталкивает общество или меняет что-то в нем, а отражает некоторые наши способности, которые мы до тех пор не замечали и которые мы сейчас механизируем. Например, есть такое понятие для того, чтобы настроиться на какой-то сайт, нужно иметь возможность иметь программное обеспечение, чтобы этот сайт прочесть. Если у вас нет там флеш-плеера, вы не увидите движущиеся картинки. И вот душа, говорят они, меня заметили, что она тоже имеет плагины. Я когда приезжаю в Ливан и попадаю в ситуацию, где реально оплакивают погибшего араба, если я не умею плакать так же, то я никогда не встрою ситуацию, потому что я не настроен на это. И вот те вещи, которые можно механизировать и какие нельзя механизировать, они, соответственно, составляют такой, скажем, спектр способностей, которые можно отдать той машине, той человеку, и мы заранее не знаем, что есть машина и что человеческая способность. Люди, которые говорят, что есть определенная антропность, да, человека, которую убрать нельзя, нужен другой подход. Поэтому я вижу тут возможность для диалога, наверное, если я понимаю вашу позицию. I'll just translate what I said. Okay, so the idea being is that there's a network of capacities between a human and a machine, or a human and non-human. And these capacities are reproportioned or reapportioned depending on what you take to be as human or as non-human, and depends on adaptation, the fact that you position right. So in a sense, the technology of the self is interesting to you because there are like internet technologies or other stuff which kind of shows the capacity for us to do something as humans with the help of these technologies, or when we re-accommodate and readapt ourselves with the help of these technologies, that's when we change ourselves. But there's no pre-established human nature.
Yes, that's right. So who is it? Spinoza's question, who knows what a body can do? Right? We aren't fixed essences.
Скажи, простите, еще интересно, почему ни у одного из докладчиков вашей физический фотос, свет. Как известно, фотон массу покоя не имеет. Да? И вот вся специфика сознания, а оно всегда во свете каком-то, либо в люминатурале, да, в естественном свете, либо в сверхъестественном свете, это вообще другую имеет устройство, если угодно. А там, где нет инерции, там ничего. Да? Где нет массы, нет инерции. И все эти вопросы становятся нерелевантными.
That's very interesting. I'm not quite sure why it would be photons you would want to talk about. I mean, it did strike me some time ago that what doesn't come out terribly clearly in kind of our usual way of writing STS stories is questions of flow and things moving around. I mean, water seems like a very interesting thing to think about, and I find myself talking more and more about examples that have to do with water. A few months ago, I wrote a paper called the Tao of Chemistry. I got very interested in Taoist philosophy. It seems to me that the Tao is all about endless flows and transformations and becomings. And it seems to me that that kind of ancient Chinese philosophy is actually a very good description of the world that we live in. Right? So if it's things like flows and becomings that you're trying to point to, then I entirely agree with you.
Terms in the manual of practice. There are two suggestions in the chapter number 1. First, that science is culture, and the second, that science is practice. That means extension of culture, cultural extension.
Right.
What does it mean? Why do you use the term culture, and what does it mean, extension of culture, cultural extension?
Well, well, the extension of culture, I was studying research, which is an activity which aims to transform the culture that it's in, to produce new knowledge, new instruments, new machines and things like that. That's one of the reasons why it's very interesting to study science, because it so obviously changes all the time. And then you want a word for whatever it is that changes, and the word that I used was culture. So it's the stuff that scientific knowledge is made out of. Material stuff, social relations, existing knowledge. New culture grows out of old culture in an open-ended process. That's the picture.
Would one say that the extension of culture is when a scientist takes some cultural method to produce a new model before one goes to test it? That was more or less the description.
No, I don't mean a cultural metaphor. I mean...
But how does one produce a new model? It's kind of an analogy, metaphorical move, right? In your chapter 1, just
Yeah, kind of, yeah. I mean, I think what I said was, the construction of the goals of practice is based upon what culture already is. And, this is a very kind of concrete thing. Donald Glaser had in front of him a machine. It was a cloud chamber. And he was thinking about, how can I make something which is like a cloud chamber but different in some way? And I tried to insist there was no prescription for going from existing culture to future culture. All you can do is try things experimentally and find out what's going to happen. So it's a kind of open-ended business.
My question goes back also to chapter first chapter. Because what you are describing now, making explicit this basic metaphors, your chapter
enlightenment world, with an emphasis on fluidity, multiplicity, and those constant changes that can grasp, but as soon as you grasp them, you already made it stable and it's unstable itself and so on. But the very notion of fluidity, which is kind of very trendy in AMT too. So, in the last AMT workshop in Oxford, I don't remember any course which uses fluidity, multiplicity, heterogeneity, and so on. Notions, sometimes they use them as ideologies, but not as concepts. It's becoming a new religion. But and fluidity is idol number one. Everything is so fluid, everything is so messy, everything is so heterogeneous. So, but what is interesting in this chapter 1 is that you're bringing back this intentionality. And it's not so easy to do, to bring back this intuition into actor network theorizing, because in Latour's description and in Prolong's description and in Wall's description, in all those guys' description, actors are non-intentional. They have no intentionality, neither in classical phenomenological way of defining intentionality, nor in analytic philosophy's intentionality, like Elizabeth Anscombe. So neither Elizabeth Anscombe nor Husserl would ever use this kind of understanding of intentionality, and I still can't understand how we can bring them together. Like I have intentionality in one hand and actor network fluidity in another, and it just doesn't fit. These ideas that have resistance and recommendation to, and those ideas resist to each other, unless you can accommodate them somehow. So how? That's my question.
And before you answer, I'll just interject. Для будущего перевода просто то, что Виктор и другие называют АНТ, это Actor Network Theory, это акторно-сетевой подход. Ну, то есть то, что ассоциируется с именем Латура. Просто иногда это может проскакивать, потому что быстро говорим. Это акроним, который известен всем, кто в специальности. Как раз, если проскакиваешь, то потом становится понятно. Ну, окей.
Well, I mean, you know, what's the problem? You know, that chapter is like 20 pages long. It seems to read okay to me, you know. You know, just empirically, the kinds of studies that I did, that I wrote about in the book, you can't understand what these people are doing without thinking that they're trying to reach some future state. And it's not, you know, something you have to dig out, because scientists are continually writing, you know, grant proposals and project descriptions. So these kind of plans, let's say plans and goals, they have to be part of the story. Not always. I mean, we don't always act with plans.
For clarification, intentionality is that they're trying to reach some future state. So
Yeah.
that's no problem.
Oh, okay.
Scallops in Prolong's description, they're also trying to reach some future state. They want to be scallops. A lot of them, plenty scallops. They're trying to be more and more scallops.
Right.
So this kind of intentionality you can attribute to scallops too without any problem.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I was thinking you couldn't, right? I mean, I don't think the scallops sit around talking to each other and saying, oh, you know, what should we do tomorrow? What's going to make us happy? Well, if we did X and Y, then we would get there.
They're just having sex and proliferating.
Yeah, right.
It's also some reaching a future state.
Yeah, it's just this kind of detour away from performance through the world of representation that interested me. And I want to say, you know, that detour is actually bound up in the performance. And so the goals and plans and everything else changes, get mangled along with everything else.
And maybe we go to chapter 2, which is about bubble chamber. This will be one incredible case that people who haven't read the book can consider. And in Russian I'll just make a clarification. Для тех, кто не читал, соответственно, эту книжку «The Mangle of Practice», таково все это выглядит магическим танцем дождя, когда все заклинают непонятную философию. Значит, рассказываю, что в главе 2
Объясняется эта логика сопротивления адаптации, за счет чего появляется научное знание, когда материал природы сопротивляется ученому. Вторая глава – это о том, как человек придумал на основании клубов пара в ванной превратить это в пузырьковую камеру, которая теперь регистрирует движение микрочастиц, физики элементарных частиц. Третья глава про итальянского физика, который пытался подвесить кусочки графита с помощью магнитного поля, чтобы посчитать дробные заряды кварков. Четвертая глава про Гамильтона, по-моему, шотландского известного геометра, который придумал теорию кватерниона. Он показывает, как везде на уровне оперирования с экспериментальным оборудованием, на уровне попытки посчитать дробные заряды и на уровне даже математических абстракций есть одна и та же логика, которая схватывается с помощью понятия этого странного сюжета по прокатыванию белья через вальцы при отжимании, что делали, наверное, наши бабушки когда-нибудь, потом в Челябинске все уже давно забыли. Значит, опять же, просто к несчастью, те студенты, которые читали все это, уже разжевали в классе. Для тех, кто это не читал, это должно выглядеть как философский нонсенс. И очень хорошо, что Олег Генезайский задал вопрос, чтобы показать, что эта метафора хорошо, но есть другая метафора, свойственная нашей российской философской традиции, где все бы это сразу съехало в сторону как нерелевантное. Вот. Но пока я попытаюсь просто выстроить обратно общее поле для дискурса, чтобы вы понимали, что происходит. Okay, thanks. And if we go into empirical chapters, or we go to your next book, I mean, it's just that we've got, yeah, we still have time, but I was explaining what was going on in chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So you mentioned the quaternions, the Morgan and the Glaser.
And you just summarized them in...
No, I just described what's the concrete case studies which,
Right.
on which you rely, that you're not an abstract philosopher, but
No,
you're a
no.
physicist who is doing the study of concrete scientific situations.
Right. So, I mean, well, we could talk about the case study of chapter 2. I can just make a few remarks about that. Or we could move on to my new ontologies paper, which is a bit different.
You choose.
Well, the question is...
You take a look at the resistance of the audience to accommodate.
Very interesting presentation and review of your research. I actually want to know much more about your understanding of the role of temporality. Actually, it is in the subtitle.
Yeah.
So, could you specify your understanding of this important issue? And my second question deals with the genealogical approach to culture. What do you think of the role of, you actually mentioned this name in your bibliography, of Leslie White? His theory of culture is still relevant to our present-day understanding of cultural process. I mean, his book, Science of Culture, in which he developed quite interesting vision of innovation process. So, Leslie White and your...
Did I cite Leslie White? I don't remember that.
Yeah, origins of our ecological crisis, you mentioned.
Wow. Did I?
You are responsible for the
I can't answer the question about White because I don't seem to know anything about him. I mean, well, temporality. I mean,
You're why another philosophical question when we just got finally on a solid basis of empirical studies?
yeah, I mean, my project was the project that I set myself was to understand how things happen in real time. What's it like to be a scientist? Most accounts that you find in history and philosophy of science or even STS are kind of retrospective ones. You help yourself to knowledge of what happened and give a kind of teleological explanation. My problem was how do things happen in real time? I've got nothing special to say about time, but the process, the open-endedness of it, emergence, these kind of concepts that go along with thinking about real time fascinate me. I mean, I'm not sure what else I could say about them.
Why don't we go further?
Well, all right. I mean, I can talk about chapter 2 for a bit. Chapter 2, the study of Donald Glaser and the bubble chamber, is the first one that exemplifies what I'd come to think of as the key concept from the mangle, which is this idea of a dance of agency between the human and the non-human. So I talk about empirical examples of the oscillation between activity and passivity of Donald Glaser, the human being, intertwined with that as the kind of reverse oscillation of activity and passivity as far as the bubble chamber is concerned. And I try and show how these periods of activity and passivity intertwine in a trajectory that finally led up to a working bubble chamber. The points that I want to emphasize about this whole process is, first of all, that it's decentered, that nobody's in control, neither Donald Glaser, the human being, nor the instrument that he's working with. The important thing is there's a decentered process here that couples the human and the non-human together. They're both transformed. The shape of the chamber changes all the time. What it does, its performance, emerges in real time. And at the same time, Donald Glaser, in various non-spectacular ways, becomes something new. His goals are changed. He wants to work in cosmic ray physics, but he ends up working in an accelerator lab. He wants to work as an individual, but he ends up leading a team of like 14 people. So the social, the material, and Glaser's knowledge of the chamber are all transformed and mangled in the same process. I think the key thing to grasp about this process, the difficult thing, is that it's an open-ended process that could go in any possible direction. This might have got something to do with what Steve Walgar was saying about it could be otherwise. Nobody, right? Literally nobody could say in advance where that dance of agency was going to lead Glaser and the bubble chamber. And this, of course, is where I depart from traditional sociology and the sociology of scientific knowledge that aims to point to something that pre-exists events and use it to explain why those events led to one place or another. Everything you feel like pointing to is liable to be transformed and mangled in practice. As I just said, I think the concept of emergence is very important here. In a very simple way, Glaser did not know in advance how this collection of components was going to act. The performance of every single version of the bubble chamber was an emergent phenomenon. Something new came into the world throughout this process. And at the same time, I think on the human side, we would have to describe Glaser's practice as emergent. There is no way of explaining the fact, for example, that he thought of trying to build a new bubble chamber. He could easily not have done that. There is no, in the end, explanation for why he's embarked on this process, and I don't think there's any explanation for the different forms of accommodation that he came up with along the way. Again, he might not have thought of doing what he actually did. He could have just given up, of course. So emergence and open-endedness, decentering. And as I said before, knowledge is indeed a part of this process, but it's not the center of it. For example, Glaser started off using a particular theory of bubble formation. You had to have some idea of how bubbles form to build a bubble chamber. And he worked with a particular theory for quite a long time. But eventually, as a kind of gloss upon the resistances that had arisen in his practice, he changed the theory. The theory wasn't the center of anything, but it kind of grew as he went along. As more and more people tried to build bubble chambers, it became an item of standard knowledge that bubble chambers had to be clean in a technical sense. They didn't have to have any metal to glass joints, and everybody believed that they wouldn't work if they were dirty in a technical sense. And people believed that until one day a technician at Berkeley, just for the sake of it, built a dirty bubble chamber, and as a matter of fact it worked. And at that point the standard knowledge about bubble chambers changed discontinuously, and that was a major event as far as building big bubble chambers were concerned. So the point is that knowledge is mangled just like social variables, goals, interests, and machines and their performances. All of these things are mangled and evolve together. And that's what I tried to illustrate in this chapter, and then elaborated it further in later chapters to include, conceptual knowledge and mathematics and things like that. All right, well that was chapter 2. Is there anything to discuss about that, or have we answered all those questions? Well then, I also gave you these 2 postscripts from the book. I don't know if anybody looked at them. The first postscript was on the topic of what I then called non-standard agency. I was struck by a kind of residual asymmetry when I was writing the book between human beings and machines. If you look at the history of science and technology, there are amazing transformations on the side of the non-humans, the machines. People build more and more powerful technological gadgets in history. Machines do more and more amazing things. Most recently the internet would be a good example of that. But when I was writing, it seemed to me that all the people I was writing about always stayed more or less the same, right? So their goals and their interests and things changed in the social structure, but deep down, Donald Glaser was always Donald Glaser, and if you go back to the early days of the scientific revolution, you could imagine that Isaac Newton was just a kind of everyday kind of guy like me. So there seems to be this asymmetry. History seems, incredible transformations in the realm of machines, but nothing much happening in the realm of human beings. In this postscript, I tried to imagine that maybe humans could change too, that we could become something different from our everyday modern selves. But I didn't have any very bright idea about this, so I started writing about kind of strange animist spirits and German minds. I remembered reading Carlos Castaneda's book, The Teachings of Don Juan, all about a separate reality and magical powers. And I thought about Eastern yogis and the various strange performances they're said to be capable of, but I couldn't really seriously develop that argument. But since I wrote the book, I've become very interested in this question of selves, our interiority, what's it like to be human, and how that can change in relation to technologies and the environment. I put some readings on this on the list that I sent to Oleg before I came here. One is a very interesting paper about digital gambling, about how human beings use machines, gambling machines, to enter into a very strange non-modern state that they call the zone. We can think about gambling machines as technologies of the self that produce a very interesting inner state, which is almost a kind of dissolution of the self. The gamblers experience themselves as coupled to the machine, as part of the machine. They become, if you like, non-modern selves. And I've become increasingly interested in non-modern selves and how they're produced. I also listed a chapter from Wolfgang Schivelbusch's wonderful book called The Railway Journey, which is a history of the development of railway travel in the 19th century. One thing that Schimmelbusch argues.
So the syllabus number 5.
One thing that Schimmelbusch argues in this book is that along with railway travel, human beings developed a new way of seeing the world that he calls panoramic seeing. He contrasts railway travel with walking. In the 18th century, there are many accounts of people walking through the environment and experiencing it in great detail and specificity, the smells, the colours, what the pavement looks like. And Schimmelbusch says there's this big disjuncture, and after people became accustomed to railway travel, they started seeing the landscape in a different way, panoramic, grasping the environment as if it's like a movie being projected, a continuous movie being projected on the window of the train. There's a kind of history of the senses being written by Schimmelbusch, which emphasizes a coupling of the senses to a particular technology, in this case railway travel. The railway is a platform for a new way of apprehending the world. And at the same time, in other chapters, we could go back to the question of who knows what a body can do. What Schimmelbusch emphasizes is that new ways for human bodies and minds to go wrong emerged with railway travel. The vibrations produced strange sicknesses in the train drivers and the passengers. And Schimmelbusch says that because of the unprecedented violence of railway accidents, new kinds of mental pathologies appeared. Shock, as we call it, entered the civilian world for the first time with railway travel. So new ways for minds to be, new ways for the senses to act, new ways for bodies to be, all came into existence with this new technology of rail. And Schimmelbusch makes this fascinating analogy with materials. He makes a connection between human fatigue and human sickness and metal fatigue. Metal discovered a new way to behave in the history of rail, new ways for metal to fail. A lot of railway accidents were caused by the fact that iron became suddenly a brittle substance due to the heavy weight of repeated trains travelling over it. We could say this is an emergent property of metal that under certain conditions it behaved in a new way and cracked. And Schimmelbusch makes the analogy between that and new ways for human bodies to go wrong. The body discovered a new way to be in the context of rail, just like the iron and steel. That's another angle on the kind of symmetry of the human and the non-human. I mentioned technologies of the self. A student of mine is now doing a fascinating PhD on meditation as a technology of the self, trying to explore inner states. And the last postscript to the mangle was where I claimed that the mangle was a theory of everything. It's not just a theory about how scientists behave in the laboratory, it's a story about how the world in general is.
It was very modest.
Yes, I know, it's very modest. But this is... I just wrote it to be provocative, of course, but since I wrote it, I've come to believe it's true. I think that the world... I think it's an ontological claim. This is what the world is like. And by ontology, I mean actually what the world is like, not those stories about ontology that Steve Walgard was talking about when I came in. The idea is that the world just is built out of dances of agency. that's the kind of place where we live, a world of endless flows and becomings and transformation. And I tried to kind of extend that idea and play it out in other studies since I wrote the mangle. I moved away from studying laboratory practice. I gave you the chapter on new ontologies where I talk about the Mississippi River and the Army Corps of Engineers. I think what you find everywhere are dances of agency. And then the interesting question is, are there different ways to be in the dance of agency? Which is where I invoke Heidegger and his contrast between enframing and poiesis as different ways of being in the world. And we could talk about that.
Can you stop for a second?
Yeah.
I mean, the term agency is notoriously difficult to translate into Russian. That's why Giddens was never understood in Russian. Because, the structure agency dilemma is very inadequately translated as well. So the dance of agency, how did you render it in Russian? Взаимодействие участников. Хорошо. Имеется в виду...
Я могу сказать танец агентов и взаимодействие участников.
Танец
на форме, как бы не подвижется, не поднимается.
Окей, все. Просто базовая метафора у него танец агентов, наверное, да, или взаимодействие агентов.
Акторов на переводе.
Акторов, да, наверное. Имеется в виду, что как человеческие акторы, так и материальные акторы, что это есть основная аналогия существующая. Просто виде песни. Окей. I just got the term.
Yeah.
Вопрос. Как вы относитесь к довольно радикальной точке зрения Фейерабенда, который радикально критикует онтологическое принуждение? Знаете, у нас сейчас ко всему принуждают. Принуждение к миру, принуждение к здоровью. А вот вы пользуетесь онтологическим принуждением.
Theory and the view of Feyerabend that is against that ontological impulsion that you follow.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Okay, there's Paul Feyerabend from what I got.
Oh, Feyerabend, right?
Feyerabend, yeah. And the question is, well, in Russian he's Feyerabend. That there's a wish to impose ontologizing on everything. So how do you see yourself in that picture after the radical critique of Feyerabend, of that drive and wish to ontologize?
I was a friend of Feyerabend. I thought we agreed with each other. So the question is, where are we going to start from? What are we going to think about when we kind of analyze the world? The ontology that I'm talking about, it's not a kind of reductive scientific ontology. I'm not trying to specify what the fundamental contents of the world are, and I'm not trying to build a picture deductively from a kind of reductive basis. That is a kind of physicist's theory of everything. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. All I'm suggesting is this very general picture of how the world is, a lively place of flows and becomings, agents, a multiplicity of them interacting with one another. And that's where we should start in unraveling what it's like to be in the world and the production of knowledge and things like that. I can't think of anything, though I could be wrong, in Feyerabend's writings that would argue against that kind of project. But maybe you can. I mean, I don't know.
Например, почему онтология, а не семантика? Да? Вот семантика является альтернативой, потому что мы, так сказать, имеем дело с образами, с текстами, с концептами и понимаем так или иначе. Но при этом ничего не полагаем, ничто так критически не утверждается относительно
like for instance, you're saying ontology. Why not semantics? Semantics could be replaceable for ontology because we're also dealing with objects, you know, living, non-living, doesn't matter. And we not in advance predict or dictate what the future state will be. So why exactly ontology, not semantics?
Well, I mean, my understanding is that semantics is about words and the meanings of words. And I'm saying we shouldn't start off by thinking about words. We should think about being in the world. I'm really talking about what being in the world is like, or what the world is like. And the philosophical word that I know for that is ontology. The point that people like Feyerabend and Kuhn made was that there are many different ways of latching onto the world in terms of words. That's their relativism, and I'm sure they're right. But the question is, what kind of a world is it that we're latching onto with our words? And how do the words help in the latching onto it?
Нет, ну, во-первых, значение имеют не только слова, но и образы, и много чего другого. Переживания, ощущения, все имеет значение.
Well, it's not just words, but you know, visions, objects, you know, sensations, images.
А во-вторых, почему мы говорим о мире в единственном числе? Вы же сами сторонник множественности миров.
And you're a proponent of multiplicity, so why is it just one world? Why not many worlds?
Yeah. And my own way of thinking about it is that there is just one world, but there are, you know, an indefinite number of ways of latching onto the world. Right? We latch onto the world through technologies and practices and things like that, and these practices produce different worlds. This is Kuhn's sense of incommensurability. There are, you know, it seems to be the case that there are many different ways of latching onto the world, and these different ways don't fit together, right? This is the sense of incommensurability, and that's the way I understand it.
Давайте дадим Эндрю закончить, а то у него еще осталось 2 страницы, я смотрю. Andy, why don't you finish the 2 pages and then or you think you're already at the end?
I'm not at the end, but it's too late to start anything new.
Some more questions? Okay.
I thought it's absolutely fascinating, your idea about how this dance actually changes a person who dances with the machine. So I thought another example would be a very interesting example. You give an example of the gambling machine.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking about the example of a video game. Because that's what I witness endlessly in my house, because my son is attached and we call the machine as a physical support machine for him, because he cannot see himself actually without this gadget. So he keeps playing and playing and playing. So, and I'm trying to say there is a debate actually whether this video gaming increases violence in people. So that might be interesting to look at in terms of how it changes not the personality, but exactly the person.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm sure you're right. Actually, when I get back to Exeter, I'm supervising an undergraduate dissertation where one of the students is looking at precisely this question. So hopefully they will answer the question. Yeah.
More questions from students? Yeah, okay.
Уверен, что я смогу правильно назвать на английском, но просто помочь вас. Мне очень интересно, когда я читал книжку, он меня возник, и мы не смогли на него ответить на семинаре, поэтому...
I'm interested in the question which arose when I was reading your book and I couldn't address it during the seminar, so I want to repeat it now, place it to the author.
выделить разные процессы производства научного знания именно самими учеными. Входит ли, можно ли выделить из этих творцов того, кто происходит процесс?
Can you distinguish between the dance of agency and the mangle of practice? Can you distinguish what?
Озарение ученого или тот процесс, который происходит в нем рутинно? Можно ли разделять эти вещи или это суть один какой-то процесс? И есть ли между ними различия, если есть, то в чем?
Can you distinguish between the illumination which the scientist experiences and the routine process? Do you think there's a border between the instances of illumination and then the routines and practices which are ordinary and boring, or there's no border between them?
Well, I think the answer would have to connect to this other phrase that I used, interactive stabilization. So, for example, at some point, so the word stabilization is important. What does stabilization mean? You could think about a contrast between kind of research practice, which is aiming to find something new, and a stabilized routine on the other hand. And the question is there a sharp distinction between them? And I think the answer is no, that nobody ever exactly repeats what they've done in the past. So novelty is always liable to arise, even in the most routine activity. So there's still emergence and open-endedness in both cases. But in the case of a stabilized routine, you have the idea of some fixed point that you're trying to arrive at, and you kind of fiddle around with the elements and try and, arrive at an expected outcome. Whereas, research practice is always kind of moving towards an uncertain goal. Sorry, that's not a very clear answer, but it's the best I can do at the moment.
You have a coffee break, right?
Yeah.
And can I add my question? What if the result is unexpected?
Which result of what?
We spoke about that you are striving for some result, and when you do, for example, but there are many cases when the result is unpredictable.
Right.
And where do you
Well, that's what I was trying to say, that, even in routinized activity, simply because one never exactly repeats what's been done before, something new might indeed emerge. Yeah. And that happens.
So routine is never always a routine.
Yeah.
I will repeat the same question to Trevor, and I posited it to Steve already. So the question right now is to you, in the sense that masterclass presupposes to discuss possible master essays, topics for the students here. You've been here, I think, in Russia, for the third time now? Well, in St. Petersburg. Second. In St. Petersburg for the second time.
Yeah, you said Trevor, but you meant Andy, didn't you?
No, Trevor, I will put the question afterwards as well.
Okay.
You will have it in the end, last 10 minutes. So, looking at the master's topics, basically the second book, The Mangle in Practice, is the works of your students who took your book seriously, and they followed it as a methodological advice on how to do research. What you described today in terms of novel type of approaches, if I were a Russian student writing something according to what you told us, it would be how the self of a Russian peasant changed when he first entered the trade, according to during the Civil War perhaps, something like that. Or I didn't think about the video gamer, But I thought about research we're doing right now for Rosnano Corporation on the changes of the selves of technological entrepreneurs, and whether as part of it they have a new technologized religiosity devices. Like, you know, you can deliver a prayer on the internet. There are ways you can exculpate your seeds fast on the internet. And whether that hinges on anything, whether this can be a useful predictor for technological entrepreneurship ethos. Now, that is already being done, and I think there's no real link, but we'll see what empirical studies will show. But in terms of your idea of the sense of agency and your double experience of visiting an agent called St. Petersburg, what would be your suggestions on possibly interesting topics given the everyday life you experienced in Russia? Like what you ran into, which Steve said, well, traffic would be the best thing to study, you know?
Yeah.
Any specific dance of agency which was, or mangle of practice, which was surprising to you in the last couple of days or in the first visit, which deserves study?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I've got no serious answer. I mean, I'm struck by what a beautiful city it is on the surface, and as I walk round, I wonder what it's like to be here and live in this particular kind of geography. So, you know, if I was here, that's the kind of ethnographic research that I would do with that.
So, ethnography, but ethnography, of course.